Note that this guide is meant for basing primarily on the mainland, so we're going to be ignoring specialty cases like ocean, lunar, and UK basing. Basing ultimately comes down to player preference. However, there are a lot of different factors that come into choosing a good base location that can help you out throughout the entirety of the game. So I wanted to cover what I think of and what, from what I can tell, other people think of whenever they're choosing a base location. There are tons of factors that go into this, so let's start by first outlining the biomes, starting with the guaranteed ones. If you don't know, Don't Starve has a bunch of guaranteed biomes and a bunch of biomes that are added after the fact. The guaranteed biomes are the spawn biome, which is exactly what it sounds like, the biome you spawn in. Usually it has a small patch of savanna turf and is plentiful in saplings, berries, grass tufts, and trees. So this is going to have basically everything that you're looking for early game. The Mandrake Forest is a biome that is usually surrounded by a forest, and always has an amount of mandrakes in it, as the name would imply. Note that these are the only ones you'll find in the game, so be very careful with them. The Moonstone Forest is a big forest with the moon pedestal and Mactusk in it. So if you find the moon pedestal, then chances are you're going to find Mactusk and vice versa. The Mactusk camp is something that appears on the map and is pretty worth making note of whenever you're coming down to actually making your decision. The Savannah has tons of grass in it with the occasional boulder and spider nest, and this tends to be where you'll find beefalo. The Queen Bee grassland is a grassland with a higher amount of bees than normal, and also includes a bee queen spawner, that being the giant hive. The swamp is the purple one. It has tentacles hidden in it, reeds scattered about, mosquito ponds wherever, and the occasional merm houses and spider nests. This is also something that's kind of worth making note of whenever you're making your base decision. The Mosaic / Graveyard / Meteor Field. This biome is always going to be combined with these three, and it's always going to be connected to the spawn biome, and it's characterized by a hodgepodge of turfs, boulders, trees, saplings, and grass tufts, but very little food. It also has a graveyard in it, which is characterized by the graves, and a meteor field in it. The meteor field itself is characterized by little hash marks on the ground and the boulders on the surface of turfless ground. Typically, it's not too hard to tell where this meteor field is. But do note that the range of the meteor field does kind of fluctuate. The way it works is, essentially you have one big circle, which is where the meteor field can be, and a smaller circle, which is where the meteor field is. So even if it doesn't look like you're right next to a meteor field, even if it looks like you're not within range of a meteor field, you might actually be still inside of it. The Pig King Forest is a deciduous biome with Pig King in it. Typically has a path leading into it and is always going to have a pan flute and a clomber statue in it. The Dragonfly Desert is characterized by tumbleweeds and brown cacti, as well as having magma pools with dragonfly hanging out in the center of them. The Oasis Desert is characterized by its distinct cacti shape and its lack of tumbleweeds. It also has a big oasis in it with, unless in summer, a dried up region and birchnut trees. It's also immune to smoldering in the summer, which is definitely something to make note of. These next biomes aren't guaranteed, but aren't too uncommon to encounter in your average world generation, with some being more desirable than others. They're guaranteed to be 15 biomes in total, with the non-guaranteed ones being limited to 5 randomly being selected at the start of a world generation. These biomes include a second deciduous biome, with no Pig King in it. Note that this tends to be a downside in World Gen, just because it's another place that Klaus can spawn in, but it is another assortment of birch nuts that you can make use of if you want to. Bee Hell is aptly named, because it's just got tons of bees in it. It's not bad. I personally will never say no to extra honeycombs. Honeycombs are just good. The Quarry and Spider Quarry are pretty common and pretty good. The Quarry has a lot of rocky turf in it and normal rocks, and the Spider Quarry is mostly the same thing, with more spiders and a forest going through it. Triple Mactusk, my beloved. I have a whole video talking about this one. It's easily one of, if not the most desirable biome, just because it gives access to more Mactusks. It gives a small grassland, a small quarry, and it's surrounded by a pseudo-savanna. It's really good, in my opinion, should be guaranteed. The Pig Village is a small area with pig houses and some berry bushes or grass tuft patches in it. This is pretty nice to have, it's just extra pigs. The Moose Goose quote-unquote hive just has a ton of moose goose nests in it. Other than that, it's basically just another grassland. A second meteor field tends to be connected to oasis more often than not in my experience, and exactly what it sounds like. It's a meteor field, but again, which isn't great. This also tends to have a higher amount of bees in it than usual, but Overall, having a second Meteor Field is more of a deterrent than not. Frog Hell is just a ton of ponds in the middle of a grassland/forest biome. It's pretty common, and it tends to have Chester in it when it spawns, so if you see it, chances are you're going to find Chester in it. Then there's the additional grassland, which is just another grassland biome. Basically has the same thing as the spawn biome. For all intents and purposes, the spawn biome is a grassland biome, except spawn has the portal, which, you know, is pretty important. So with all this new information in mind, where should you base? Well, it's complicated. Basing in this game is a coalition of tons of different factors that might seem daunting at first to make note of, but hopefully I could break it down by discussing what I myself and what other people I've played with tend to run down in order to make things easier when it comes to choosing a base location. Starting off with making note of the biome-specific resources. Not all biomes are made the same. It's a lot harder, if not impossible, to move certain resources away from one biome into another. So what are these resources that you can't move from the biomes, and how much do they matter? Starting off with Bee Queen. This boss is impossible to move from one location to another. So where you find the big beehive is where Bee Queen is going to stay for the rest of the world. Which can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. It all depends on where it spawns. The moon pedestal is a structure that is useful for turning your star collar staffs into a moon collar staff and farming tons of moon rock, and it's also immovable. Mactusk is a superb enemy to farm in winter whenever you can, but it can't be moved, so if you're going to kill them manually, then you better make note of where they are. An honorable mention goes out to reeds, because while you can plant cattails from Mooncay, it's very difficult to do so early on consistently without getting lucky with World Gen, or revealing the area on the map, which then getting lucky with the loot spat out from the portal, which isn't always consistent, and oftentimes takes quite a bit of time. Pig King trades trinkets and meat for gold, which is a valuable resource for 90% of the characters at most any given point in time. Cacti is an amazing source of sanity and counts as veggies in the crockpot, and they also grow during winter, making them an excellent food source. But they're locked down to their respective deserts. Meteors are actually one of the things on this list that you don't want to base near, but also have the downside of not being able to move them. Meteors will destroy structures that hit them, and you have no way of relocating meteors, effectively locking you out of the area that these spawn in. I would recommend giving them a wide berth when it comes to choosing a base location, so make note of where they are and say, I don't want to be there. Ponds, depending on how you look at them, could be a good or bad thing to base near. They're great for filling watering cans if you do farming somewhat consistently, but they also spawn mobs that are annoying to deal with, such as frogs and mosquitoes depending on the pond type. So why do these things matter? You don't want to base near a meteor field first off. I think that's an important bit. And more importantly, you want to be in a location where you can make use of all of these resources as easily as you can. For example, if you want to get as much use as possible out of Pig King, but it's 2 biomes away from the oasis, then it's probably not a good idea to base in the oasis, and you should probably consider basing somewhere in between the 2. Likewise, if you're playing a character who can't really make use of reeds as effectively as others, or if those characters aren't present in your server, then it's probably not a good idea to base in or near the swamp. When you're picking a base location, it's important to take these resources into account, as well as character choice and individual playstyle. But for the most part, you want to base near as many immovable resources as possible that you will actually use. Making note of the wormhole spawn is also something that is pretty good, just because wormholes can lead from one biome to another, or at least bring you closer to resources that would otherwise be across the map. Wormholes could also take you to and from certain biomes that are desirable, and cut you back on a ton of travel time. So it's typically a pretty good idea to make note of what wormhole leads where, which you can do that with skins or by installing a wormhole mark mod. Either way, wormholes can be a very good resource, and it's definitely something that you want to look for. Team composition is definitely something to take into account, like recognizing that you might want to base near the swamp in order to support the wicker bottom or the wort. So for example, you're not going to get much value out of basing near an immovable resource like Bee Queen if you aren't a character who can make use of farming her, or if you yourself don't want to farm Bee Queen and don't go through the trouble of killing her more often than you need. So for example, if you're playing a character like Walter, or you have Walter in your team, and you don't really have a character that can support killing Bee Queen consistently, chances are you're not going to get much value out of it, just because if you're not willing to kill Bee Queen, you're not going to be able to farm Bee Queen. You will, however, get much more value out of basing near Pig King as a character who needs tons of gold, like Wigfrid, or basing near Bee Queen as a Winona who farms her on cooldown. I do feel like I'm doing an injustice in not bringing up one of the additional other factors. Though this isn't part of the mainland per se, I feel like it's worth bringing up that having a good cave entrance could also make or break a base location. The caves could act as secondary wormholes in a pinch, though they do take a lot longer just because you have to sit through a loading screen every time. But checking a nearby cave in order to tell whether or not there's another cave entrance that leads outside to another desirable biome could also save certain world generation. As far as the caves themselves go, they're not a terrible place to base, just because their biggest flaw is also their biggest boon. That being, caves don't really have a lot of content in them, so you're not going to get swarmed by bosses in the caves, and the only thing that you're really going to have to deal with is depth worm attacks, which can be handled by setting up a bunch of rabbits. As far as locations that are worth mentioning in the caves, there are really only two. The Blue Mushroom Forest could be a tremendous boon for you and your team, and having the ruins nearby a cave entrance could also cut back on quite a bit of time. It's definitely a good idea to take into account that most resources in this game can be moved, and you should move as many renewable resources as possible to your desired base location. So things like grass tufts, saplings, berry bushes, rock fruit, things of that nature can all be moved. So if you just dig them up and then plant them down at your base, preferably if your base is near somewhere that has a lot of immovable resources, you'll then have those immovable resources, as well as whatever grass tufts, saplings, berry bushes, the list goes on, that you are willing to move. Don't be afraid to choose a base location with some dangers present, keeping in mind that you can clear out most dangers given enough time. To clarify, I am saying it's okay to base in the swamp. You can clear out the dangers over time. If it's in a good location, then base there. Don't be afraid to. Keeping in mind that you are going to have to take things a little bit more cautiously early on until you get to a point where you can clear out the entirety of the swamp or Pig King and his minions if you're a monster character, things like that. Don't let stopgaps get in your way of a prime base location. Overall, it's hard for me to say definitively where a good base location is, but in my personal experience, what I tend to do is I tend to look at the map. If there are 2 or more immovable resources within one congested area, typically I tend to choose to base there. There is something to be said about basing in Oasis, but you shouldn't go into a world with the sole intention of basing at Oasis. Oftentimes I see people fall into this pit trap of loading into a server immediately knowing I'm going to base in Oasis, even if it's across the planet, far removed from any other resource with no wormhole leading out of it. While it could help you during summer, I don't think the time spent going to and from Oasis is necessarily worth it in those scenarios. It's something that you have to measure yourself in regards to whether or not you're willing to make those trips. I personally wouldn't recommend things like that. People also fall into the pit trap of always basing at Pig King. I don't really know why. Pig King, while he is a fine resource, you also have to take into account, a lot of the times you're probably going to go to Pig King for gold in bulk. So after you clear the ruins, after you get a tons of trinkets from robbing graves, things of that nature, you only visit him every so often, unless you're playing a character that really benefits from gold, like Wigfrid. Obviously there are exceptions to every rule. Every world is going to be unique, and you definitely need to take into account whether or not the world gen is in your favor. Sometimes you have to bite the bullet, and base locations aren't the greatest to come by in certain worlds. In these scenarios, I would honestly probably just reset the world. Just because I know if I'm going to pour a ton of time into a world, I don't want to feel miserable throughout the entirety of it just because I got screwed over by world gen. That just isn't something that's enjoyable for me. Overall, keep an open mind about where you want to base in the world. It's definitely a decision that is going to impact you throughout the entirety of your game. It's definitely something that you should take your time analyzing, whether or not you want to base in one location or another. Over time, when you begin to analyze what you tend to prioritize and how many resources of a certain biome you use, you're going to have a certain tendency to base closer to certain resources over others. I definitely feel this whenever it comes to Bee Queen, because I feel like I kill Bee Queen more often than the average player. So if it comes down to it, then I'll lean towards basing closer to Bee Queen than something like basing in Oasis. All these things compile into picking a good base location, and you'll get better at picking one without too much thought over time. Rest assured that people definitely get better and better at picking a base location, and it ultimately just comes down to basing near immovable resources, in its most simplest form. Hopefully this video helped in some way. I think picking a base location is definitely something that people don't emphasize nearly as much as they should, because a lot of the times I do just see people say OasisBases, and that's the extent of their thought process whenever it comes to picking a base. And like, I don't think that's really all too great. There's nothing wrong with Oasis, but like, you know, think things through whenever you're picking a base location, because sometimes people are picking really bad locations for it. But that's all I wanted to talk about. Hopefully this video helped in some way, and until next time, bye-bye.